Good morning. I'm Xiaohong Wen, a professor from University of Houston. I'm in applied linguistics with research interest in L2 Chinese acquisition and learning motivation. First, I would like to thank the Asia Society for scheduling this plenary to hear students' voice on their own learning motivation. We have a group of brilliant students here who will briefly introduce themselves, including their names, number of years they have been learning Chinese, and the schools they are currently attending. Let's start with Trace. I see you at the top.
Hi, everyone. I'm Trace St. Julian. I'm currently a senior at the Kincaid School in Houston, Texas, and I started learning Chinese my freshman year, so this is my 4th year of learning Chinese.
Can we just proceed? Can we hear you?
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so my name is Blake Deckard. I'm a junior at the University of Houston, and I've been studying Chinese for about 6 years.
Okay, let's just continue. Oriana?
My name's Oriana Jermiel. I'm a senior at Grandview High School in Colorado, and I also started studying Chinese my freshman year, so I've been studying for about 4 years now.
Okay.
Yep, and my name is Amani, or Ke Yiming. I have studied Chinese for over a decade now, starting in middle school, and I'm going to grad school through the Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University in the fall. Nice to meet you all.
Congratulations, all, particularly the one to Tsinghua and all. Thank you, everyone. This panel starts with discussion questions and ends with Q&A. In the process, the panelists will interact to discuss 4 topics. The first topic or the first theme is, what is your initial motivation for choosing to learn Chinese among a number of language options offered at your school? Amani, can you be the first one to address this theme?
Of course, I'd be happy to. Before I go, I just want to thank the panelists, thank you, Wen Laoshi, and then thank you, Asia Society, for being able to have the session today. So for me, I describe my decision to choose Chinese as kind of like a push and pull. And I'd say that at my middle school, it was required for us to study language. I would have studied German because I spent a few years in Germany, but I decided to go with Spanish. However, in that first year, I was feeling pushed away from Spanish and pulled towards Chinese. I would say I was pushed away from Spanish because I thought it was a little easy, comparatively speaking. I was a very ambitious middle schooler. I had like a 96.2% in the class, and I didn't know how I was being challenged. But also across the hall was the Chinese program. It was a new program. This was the 2nd year running. And I was always hearing that they were able to engage in characters. It was a very difficult language. And a big part was probably the names. So in Spanish class, I didn't have a new name. But in Chinese class, what our teacher did was after 2 to 3 weeks in the classroom, you would get a name based on your personality. So after those 2-3 weeks, I was very excited to have my name Ke Yiming. And everyone in the classroom was comparing notes like, oh, how hard is your name to write? What are the tones? What does it mean? And that was kind of how it started for me and how it was both new and challenging. And it's been a theme as I continued on throughout the language.
Terrific. Oriana?
So I also studied Spanish starting in middle school when I was in 6th grade. And I think when I started studying Spanish is when I really felt like a pull towards language in general. I've always been more of a language arts oriented person. I'm not very math science oriented, so I've always loved English and I love taking Spanish. And when I was going into high school, I was just going to continue on my career with Spanish, but my best friend is actually Chinese. And I remember her trying to explain her name to me her name is May. And she was like, yeah, my name is May Lita May. And I was like, well, your name's not May Lee, it's just May. And she was like, yeah, but it's May Lita May. And I remember not grasping the concept at all. But I think that was kind of intriguing to me, and that made me want to just continue and add a new language to my repertoire, I guess, because it was just interesting to me. And also it was a way for me to get to know her better and her culture better and understand her better as a friend in a friendship aspect.
Trace?
Yeah, I mean, my motivation for learning Chinese really comes from three things. And the first thing is the challenge of it. Like Amani said, Chinese is a difficult language to learn, and that was something that kind of stood out to me. It's almost like learning two languages at once. You have to learn both the characters and the pronunciation, the pinyin of those characters. So it really is a difficult language. And if you're a student who's looking to push yourself in the classroom, Chinese is the way to go as far as languages go. So that was the first thing. The second thing was the rising influence of China. Just in my lifetime, China has become a complete superpower on the world stage. And I look at Chinese as a language that very well might be helpful to know or have a basic understanding of in the future. And then the third thing was Chinese culture. I feel like Chinese culture isn't as highlighted in pop culture. And then here in Houston, where I live, where we are somewhat close to the border, especially here, we see it. We see kind of Mexican culture at the forefront, whereas Chinese and Asian culture is kind of on a back burner. So I look at my Chinese class as an opportunity to learn more about a culture that isn't as highlighted in the communities that I have grown up in. So those are my three reasons for being motivated to learn Chinese.
A lot of my motivations similarly are very similar to Amani's and Trace's, where I saw the difficulty of the language, especially around the characters, and thought it was very, very intriguing. And I also saw the rising geopolitical importance of China. And when I was very young, I knew that I wanted to lead like an international career. So I thought that, well, it might be very great to pick up Chinese because, well, it's very different, it's very difficult. And I thought that if I mastered it, or if I had a really great understanding of it, it might be able to open some opportunities that I wasn't able to pursue before. And then also, just relative to the other languages being French and Spanish in my school, I thought that would be really interesting and be able to give me a new perspective, sort of like Trey said, be able to see the world in new ways that maybe I hadn't considered before, just by studying your culture, much unlike mine.
Wonderful, wonderful. And also, this push and pull, summarize lots of initial motivations. And Ke Yiming, Amani, could you please elaborate or discuss about the push and pull a little bit further?
Of course. So I just like to always think of that push and pull, like what's pushing me away from this specific thing and pulling me towards something else. And with Chinese, there's a lot of things that's pulling me towards it that made me really want to study it. That definitely goes with what everyone else was saying, the curiosity, the challenge, trying to connect with friends in our communities. And the fact that even despite the geopolitical tensions, despite the challenges, that we're still being pulled toward this language, I think that does speak volumes. The fact that, this is my second, third time maybe meeting Trace, Blake, and Oriana, but we have a lot of overlaps in what pulls us towards the language.
Yes, pull to Chinese. Push is important too, but, to choose Chinese, to learn Chinese, got to be some, internal desire, strong desire, that kind of thing. Anybody like to add something for initial motivation in learning Chinese?
I think a lot of it also was the concept of the challenge behind Chinese. We saw a lot of, we could understand that it was very different, but maybe, that essence of difference also represented a challenge to us. And I think being someone driven, I think we all are very driven as students, that was something that really drove us to want to choose this and want to pursue it further, was that pull of there's this really great challenge, sort of like Amani said, where he studied Spanish, and then sort of stepped away because there wasn't that challenge. And I think that really resonates with me as well.
Definitely. You all mentioned that by choosing learning Chinese to learn Chinese, you expect challenges and the uniqueness of the language, the Chinese language, as well as the culture, which is, most unlike your own. So this curiosity, as you mentioned, and also the love of challenges that echoed by everybody are deeply rooted in learners. Most important thing exists there. In addition, you also talked about the usefulness or the significance of the language. For example, the geopolitical importance of China and the pursuing an international career. Those are important too. And last but not least, the environment, the Chinese people, the identity, or the desire to identify yourself with Chinese friends, with the Chinese people are important too. So in that environment, the environment pulled you into learning Chinese. That's great. So we're going to move to the second question. The second topic is, in the learning process, what kind of difficulties did you encounter and how did you overcome them? We'll start with Oriana.
Yeah, so when learning Chinese and also when learning Spanish, one of my weaknesses in learning any languages is listening. And I found, especially with Chinese, because of the tones and also like the different dialects, it was particularly hard to listen to native speakers or fast speakers when they were talking. It would really freak me out to have someone talk to me who was a native speaker, and I would have no idea what they were saying because I would hear one word that I didn't know and then get super hung up on it. So I think that presented a unique challenge to me, but it just is important to kind of calm down, I guess, and take a step back and realize that I don't have to know every single word in order to be able to understand a conversation. And it's not like about being perfect, it's just about being conversational, and it doesn't have to be so strict and rigid. So, yeah.
Tracy?
Yeah, so the first challenge I encounter when learning Chinese is very similar to Oriana's. It's not knowing a certain few characters in reading or certain few pronunciations in conversation, and how that might sometimes prevent you from understanding a sentence or a phrase as a whole. So for me, the way that I try to overcome this is by using deductive reasoning. I remain confident in what I do know within the sentence, and I use that knowledge to make an educated guess on what the characters that I don't know are. And in many cases, that can help you understand whatever sentence you're reading or what people are telling you in a conversation, and that's always extremely helpful. And of course, remaining confident in that is key. The second thing that I struggle with sometimes is difficulties connecting pinyin with characters and vice versa. So sometimes I'll know the meaning of a pinyin pronunciation, but I wouldn't be able to identify the corresponding character. Or other times I might know the meaning of a character, but I can't pronounce it in pinyin. So this is, for me, the best way for me to overcome this is by always studying the two, pinyin and characters, side by side until I'm proficient in both of them. Because I feel like that allows me to constantly form connections, both between kind of my English understanding and characters in pinyin, but more importantly, the connection between pinyin and characters. So in textbooks that always have the pinyin right next to the characters in example conversations they have or whatnot, that's extremely helpful for me in helping to overcome that challenge.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add to that. And I think I want to separate it between two categories, kind of the lower level, like what are some things I faced in the classroom when I was first learning, but also higher level. What are some of the things that are a little more difficult to tackle rather? Lower level, I mean, just like everyone else is saying, the tones are naturally difficult in memorizing the pinyin. I know what I did at first was I would just memorize what the pinyin should be. For example, I knew what this character was. This should be a first tone. This should be a second tone, third tone, so on and so forth. And it kind of takes me back to when my teacher was like, here are the 4 tones. Ta-da for 1, yes. For 2, so for 3rd, and no for 4th. And it was just really fun to just have to think about every single character like that, because after repetition, I could actually hear the difference. But first I knew what it was supposed to be, and that was extremely helpful. But I think even broader level, I think it's really difficult to have the confidence to trust your competence in the language. So after years of studying, it's really hard to know, can I actually have a conversation with someone on the street, or can I actually communicate with them? And this was tested for me when I was able to go to China for a week in middle school. And it was the first time I actually used Chinese with someone on the street. I really needed to use the bathroom. And I went into a restaurant and they kept on giving me a menu. And I kept saying, like, no, I have to use the bathroom. Can I use the bathroom? And they just thought I wanted to order food. And after a certain point, I had to use the one sentence I had to say in Chinese class before using the bathroom of like, 我可以去厕所吗? And after I said that, he actually showed me to the bathroom. And it was actually the only sentence I used in Chinese for that first week because I was so scared, but definitely showed me the ways that I could level up my own Chinese. And that was before, then I went back to high school and was studying in the classroom. But I always think about that moment when I was asking my teacher, I feel like I study well and have been learning a lot, but I really want to be able to improve my Chinese just to like tackle any problem. I don't know how to say the word, okay, but I can speak around it and talk about the word. And I think that that's what kind of led me to study at Beijing Normal University for a year. And I think that's when a lot of these things were changing, where regardless of the challenge, I felt that I had the toolkit to actually overcome it linguistically.
Perfect. Yeah. So I can definitely say that I've definitely experienced all of the challenges that all 3 of you have faced as well. I think every learner has faced at least one or more of these challenges. But I think the biggest thing for me was learning how to learn Chinese. Because relative to all of my other classes, Chinese was rather indefinite. My goal is to be fluent or be able to have word proficiency. But when I go to my math classes, I go to my science classes, I go to my English classes, it's just okay. Read these books, do these things, and then that's it. And so I felt this very strange way of, okay, well, how do I do this? Because this is a much bigger project. It's not really outlined for me. And so what I did was I tried to step back and think of my learning as a system. So I have my inputs, which is how am I going to study, and my outputs, which is my Chinese language ability. And so essentially I just organized and said, okay, well, I sort of have the issues that Trace has, where sometimes I can't really match the words in the pinyin. So I need to create some sort of way, to make sure that I'm studying new words and then reviewing those words that I don't know. So I started to use new flashcard systems to try and sort of get through those new words. And that had a lot of great knock-on effects for learning in the classroom as well, because I felt that it helped maximize my time there. It sort of kept me going. But more than anything, it was just stepping back and saying, okay, where are my bottlenecks? And for me, that was the ability to match those characters, the ability to hear and understand. And then once I started working on those things, I really felt that my ability to learn had improved significantly.
Thank you so much. You have used a variety of strategies. I have a few questions. I'll start with Oriana. You mentioned that when you do listening, when you listen particularly Chinese natives, or even listening in class, you get anxious and you try to calm down yourself. How did you calm down yourself? What is the process of calm down yourself, and how did you get rid of this anxiety?
Yeah, I would say it's just like sometimes I think that things are really serious, and nothing is really ever that serious, I don't think. So I just have to kind of talk myself down from that spot and be like, well, it's just a listening practice, and it's not essential that I know everything because I'm still learning and I'm not expected to be perfect either. So I think kind of like first just dismantling those expectations that I have for myself, and also that I feel like others have for me, even though no one really cares what I do personally. I think that's the first step to kind of minimizing it as an issue in my head, and then just moving on. I think it's important to not spend too much time dwelling on it, because if I do, then obviously it's just going to make me more emotional and upset and anxious. So I just kind of let it, I feel it, and then I let it go. It's like waves. It comes in waves, and then I let it go at the same, so I don't get super hung up on it.
Definitely. Actually, learning anxiety is kind of emotional, is affective factors. However, to calm yourself down is cognitive, at least is metacognitive, right? Come on, what is the big deal? And then, so cognitive and affective or emotional factors all influence the learning at the same time. Thank you very much. And also, Amani, I have one question on tones. These are all the difficulties we are confronting when learning a Chinese. You mentioned that it is a should be. It is a should be 1、2、3、4. How did you do it? Can you elaborate a little bit?
For sure. So I think that in Chinese, because when I was first studying, my ear was not accustomed to the tones, in the same way that your mouth is not accustomed to change shape with it, like like that type of stuff. And for when we have a dictation like a tingxie, I would just remind myself, okay, I almost focus more on the pinyin. Like I naturally had to be able to write the characters, but I didn't consider myself to know the word unless I knew what the tone should be. Because as my teacher would say the tone, I just didn't hear it in the beginning. And just by memorizing like, oh, I know that this is supposed to be this, therefore what she's saying is that. And then after that repetition, after maybe months of like doing that, using that type of strategy, I actually was able to hear the difference. After that, it was like, okay, I can hear it now. Can I repeat it? And that becomes a different issue. But I just scaffolded it in terms of what should it be? Okay, now I know what it is. Now I can hear it. But now can I produce it myself? It just took some practice, and it depends on what you prioritize. But I wanted to prioritize at least trying to know the tones and having that accent. And it just started with trying to memorize them at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Very helpful to learners and also to teachers. And, it seems that the difficulties are from different dimensions. One of them is linguistic dimension. So-called linguistic is, tones and characters, as Trace and Blake mentioned. Trace had this difficulty. Actually, we all have this. It's just, practice and side by side to match characters and the sound and the meaning. And also like listening and reading comprehension is something, because we learn Chinese as a second language in the US. So it become a difficult part, mapping sound and orthography, the Chinese writing. As we can see, you all have put so much effort, tremendous effort in learning, particularly learning characters and many other things. And I like to mention that your self-regulatory mechanisms, as mentioned by Trace and Blake, is so important, plays an important role in the learning process. And this learning process is mostly important thing for motivation and for self liberation, like what Oriana said. As such, they are not, these difficulties is not demotivating anymore. It just because you love challenge, and you love to take a risk. And so that develops self-confidence, as you mentioned, and this self-confidence and also the desire to be fluent becomes so strong. Okay, and in the process, cognitive skills and learning strategies also played a role. So you can see that this complexity of motivation interacts with all these variables of your own. Okay, we're going to move to the third theme. The third theme actually has the similarities with the second one, that is sustained motivation. Sustained motivation is much more complex than initial motivation. So we all come, our first year Chinese is large, and then our fourth year Chinese probably is really shrink so much. Sustained motivation is so important. The question is, what inspires you to sustain your learning? What type of motivation is significant to you? Let me start with Trace.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that I feel like inspire me to sustain my learning. And the first thing is the possibility of minoring in Chinese in college. So I'm a senior. I'll be going to college next year. And because Chinese is something that I do want to continue learning, a minor in Chinese, it does really appeal to me. So, I want to keep pushing myself to prepare for tracks such as that. And then it's kind of the second thing would be kind of the constant desire to be more fluent. There really is a true motivation. It is really fun to be able to have a conversation or be able to read or write in Chinese, knowing that you have cultivated these skills yourself. Language is something that nobody else can learn for you. So seeing yourself become more and more proficient in a language is something that really brings a sense of pride to me. And then the last thing is kind of like what the future holds. Will I ever, conduct business where being able to speak Chinese is helpful or even required? I want to study business in college. So that sort of thing really kind of inspires me to continue my learning, those three things.
Terrific. Ariana?
Yeah, I would say some of the same things. I do want to study abroad when I'm in college. I'm also planning to study international business. So I think that studying abroad would be really fun. And also getting a minor in Chinese would make that a lot helpful, more helpful than it would be if I didn't have any language skills. Also, I think I get motivation through little tiny things that happen. Like I go to a restaurant and I can read the menu in Chinese, or I hear someone talking and I can pick up a few words, or I can talk with my friends in Chinese. And it's just little things where I'm all that I've been doing hasn't been for nothing. And I can see the results in little fractions of what it is.
Blake?
Yeah, so I definitely share a lot of the same inspirations as Oriana when it comes to the use of the language and finding it in the real world. One place that I've really found it really useful is, one place that gives me a lot of sustained motivation is using language exchange apps and going online and talking to other people, or even just going face to face and trying to use my Chinese in the real world and seeing that there is sort of a meaning to it beyond the classroom. Because I found that this really allows me to feel like it really has use. It's not something that's just in the classroom. It's a real thing that people do in a place. Even though I'm not exposed to it every day, I just try and do my best to find those little things to allow me to use it, to allow me to be exposed. And that always inspires me to keep going.
That's great. I mean, language use, as you all mentioned, it's not a classroom language. By no means. Beyond the classroom, beyond the USA. And Amani, would you like to mention something?
Oh, of course. Sorry. I just want to let you say what you wanted to say. But no, I agree with you. Language use is not always going to be confined to the classroom, but that's often where we start. And for me, my sustained motivation, I talked about the example of going to China for that week in middle school. I think that really planted the flag for my motivation because I always knew what I was studying for. I think because of those type of linguistic challenges I faced in the country showed me that there's always more to learn. So when it comes to my inspiration, or rather what sustained my learning and my motivation, it was always in two camps where one, it was for myself and then it became for others. And I say for myself because, I just really wanted to be really good at Chinese. Like it was really that simple because there's so much I could learn. And I felt that the more I learned, the more I can communicate with people, and the more I can understand about Chinese culture. So I felt that throughout college, I was really striving to get a certain grade or a proficiency level, simply because my first dream job was to be a translator or interpreter. As I went through college and talked to more people, that changed a lot. But I can't be an interpreter or a translator unless I'm better at Chinese than native Chinese speakers. And that's obviously a very ambitious goal. And that's not how I look at it now, but that's how it started. So that really pushed me forward in terms of how can I get my language better so I can communicate with everyone more so that I can actually pursue this professional interest. But I think it changed. It really changed when I started to become a teacher and tutor, because you're not the best teacher, or rather, let me rephrase that. In my experience, knowing the most is not the most conducive to being a great teacher. I actually felt when I was a Chinese teacher, my Chinese language actually went down because I needed to find better ways to communicate with my students. But it was really important to me because Chinese language was the medium to connect with other people and show them what I've learned from my experiences in China and through my studies. So I think now what sustains my motivation is just so I can help those around me and improve the language of those around me and just help them connect the dots, so to speak. And with that, the two things that I've been really focusing on, there's one thing I talked with the panel about is I'm trying to write this Chinese book about a Black student going abroad, just to see how can we really frame identity and community in a broad context, because I felt that I've grown so much through those experiences, and I've talked to other people who have grown similarly. But I also do this Chinese language group with this nonprofit called NABIA, which is the National Association for Black Engagement with Asia, just for Black professionals who want opportunities to speak more Chinese. And I mentioned those examples because I noticed there's a shift between what's for me and what's for others. So I think my motivation now comes for how can I help those around me, given that I feel that I've accomplished my goals linguistically for Chinese. Yeah, it's really fun. You meet a lot of cool people, and it's really exciting.
I can see this enjoyment, this fun things that you guys all expressed. That reminds me of the goal. Traditionally, we identify motivation also as goal, goal-oriented. It's more than goal. It's, yes, you all mentioned the goal, career goal, linguistic goal, all those things. It is more than that. It's ideal self. It's who you are, the ideal self and the current self and the ideal self. There is a distance. So subconsciously or consciously, you are progressing to that ideal self. That ideal self becomes the strong drive for learning. And also, I really looking forward to your book, Amani. That is going to be very interesting and exciting project, and the book for all people to read. As you mentioned, people have different background. People have different goals or ideal self. However, we learn from each other. Something inspiring is important. And just then, when we talk about difficulties, we talk about, a story, for example, 我要上厕所. You you were polite, but you don't get the people don't get the hint. So 我要上厕所 is the way to use language. Once you use language, and then voila, everything works. I have one student, he said he went to Chinatown right here in Houston, and he said 我要睡觉，就是来饺子馆，我们这儿有一个来饺子馆，我要睡觉。He said that twice, 3 times, and then the 服务员 looked at him and says, "Why don't you go home? 回家睡吧." So all of a sudden he realized that his tone, all the tones are wrong. So can you tell me some stories, like examples, like what Amani mentioned, and actually you all mentioned, like how you overcome difficulties, or how you face the challenge, and how you sustain your motivation, that kind. Anybody?
Yeah, I think for me it was sort of what I touched on before, like when I started incorporating sort of those daily flashcards that I started to do every day. I felt that my learning was going like much more exponential, and I spent much less time reviewing because I was studying every day, and much more time learning new things, which gave me a really great sense of motivation. But then also just being able to, doing everything I can to try and interact with native speakers, and really gave that usefulness to the language. What made me feel like it was outside the classroom. So for instance, I go online and I'll try and make connections, make Chinese friends online, and that's something that's really helped me in terms of making my language feel like I had something real, and being able to sort of build connections with it and try and express myself, and learning how to express new ideas. I remember in my very first language exchange call ever, of course, my English, my listening ability was not very strong. I got so nervous I couldn't speak, and they're like, "Can you say anything other than ni hao?" And I was so strung up. But then over time, I could see myself progress, and feeling that motivation just kept growing and growing and growing as I was able to do more and more. And it really just made me feel like I could really do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know Blake. He actually is not an extrovert person, at least in my class. However, from introvert to so-called extrovert when he speaks Chinese, he's so eloquent. I know that process, from ni hao, even ni hao is a struggle, to now it's a long way. I know you put so much effort, and those are the important things that we need to share and then to inspire students. Other comments?
I'll add. So like Amani said, for most people who learn Chinese, the classroom is where it sort of begins. And I feel like establishing a sort of confidence from the get-go is really important when it comes to overcoming challenges or setbacks you might have in the future. So I feel like the biggest thing for this is kind of having a lighthearted, supportive environment in the classroom where teachers encourage learning from mistakes rather than pointing out errors, which many times are pronunciation errors. And like Oriana said earlier, it kind of makes it less formal. It makes the learning process less formal and more fun. And having that approach to Chinese, I feel like allows you to kind of roll with the punches and any mistakes that you have in the future. So having that lighthearted, supportive environment within the classroom, I feel like is step one.
Yes, the environment, as you and Ariana mentioned, are important. You all mentioned the goals. Okay, although I just mentioned that there's something more profound than goals, but goals are important, very profound. But, self-identity, this ideal self, something, the ideal self is significant. And, the goals, for example, you mentioned that the constant and the strong desire to become fluent in Chinese language, a better understanding of Chinese culture, and the possibilities for future career development are significant. These are motivators for you to continue. However, there are something beyond that, right? And for example, the intrinsic motivation really inside you, such as the joy of learning Chinese, particularly in using the language, and particularly in using the language to communicate, and particularly the communication worked. Okay, you order the dumplings and you have found the bathroom. So these things are so positively, constantly give you pleasure. Those are important. So using the language for communication and would bring you a great sense of satisfactory and also pride in yourself. So all those also add into the motivation. We're going to go to the last one, the last topic that is very much classroom oriented. And the topic is, in a classroom setting, what in the environment, for example, the curriculum, class activities, teachers, peers, classmates, what motivates and what would demotivate your learning? Blake, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So from a motivation perspective, I really enjoy when we have interactive activities with positive teacher engagement. So for instance, I really like when the professor will introduce a new grammar point, and then we go around the room, and she gives us maybe a few examples, so we have some comprehensible input on how to use the grammar point. And then we all go around the room and give an example to the class of how this can be used. And this sort of allows us to hear a lot of ways that it can be used, but then also, produce a lot of output ourselves. And it's this balance of, being able to get a lot of comprehensible input to understand different connotations and different ways that it can be used. But then also having this other side where the professor can support and make sure that the students are using it well. And then if they use it well, give them some encouragement. Maybe if there's a really great example, we can repeat it a few times. And I think this allows us to really get to sort of the meat of the idea on how to communicate. And so I really, really like those activities and find them motivating.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add to that with the motivation and demotivation. I think motivation, there were three things that really stuck out to me in my learning. And the first was when I was in high school, we need to do this song, a play. We need to make a play or a skit for Parents Weekend as families came into the classroom. And our group, we adapted a song from Mulan. We talked about like 糖醋鱼, like 我的糖醋鱼好好吃极了, and like we were able to sing it, and it was so silly, but it was something that was a lot of fun. And I think that it's because we were able to innovate and explore and just like have fun at the end of the day. And there were other examples like that that became a little more professional when I was in China at Beijing Normal University in my newspaper class. I think in the semester, every student gave 2 presentations. And what we had to do, we had to look at the newspaper, just like choose 500 characters, a segment, take like 10 characters we don't know, explain them in Chinese, ask some questions, and we were able to actually lead the class. We were the teacher. And it was an extremely difficult challenge, but it was a lot of fun to see what teachers go through to lead a class. Naturally, the circumstances were different because this was an immersion program, but just be able to sit in the front of the class and lead. I know I have tried to mimic that when I was teaching slightly. Like sometimes I would play like Simon Says, like 西蒙说, and I would ask the students to do this, but sometimes I would give the students the opportunity to be Simon and give commands to the classroom. And I found that the ability to lead the classroom through innovation and exploration was really fun. And by doing that, you make a lot of mistakes. I'm not going to pretend about that, but through those mistakes, it becomes more fun, and you get to test the boundaries of what learning is.
Definitely. Make mistakes and take risk is a huge learning strategy and mostly important thing in second language learning. And it has been proved by many research studies. Yeah, Blake?
I did want to say, like sort of the activities that Amani is talking about, when I was earlier in learning my Chinese journey, I really found those activities, when I didn't have so much of that internal motivation, I really found that those activities that were really fun helped me get engaged and helped me build engagement and build motivation. And then it sort of transitioned to these more communication-focused things once I sort of had that ground. So I just wanted to add that sort of how that journey changed over time from like beginner to maybe as it progressed up.
That's great. Trace?
Yeah, I mean, my motivation in a classroom setting is extremely similar to Amani and Blake. The ability to express knowledge in a creative way, rather than only through assessments, quizzes, tests, etc. I mean, not only is it a lot more fun, but I feel like it connects you to the language more. So in my classes, something that myself and my classmates have loved doing is making music videos similar to the song that Amani made, and making those videos, you have a great time doing it, and it kind of pushes you in a sense. If you want a certain lyric within your song, obviously you're going to have to learn how to work in that lyric with the vocab that you have at the moment. So those creative ways are a lot of fun for me, and that definitely motivates me in a classroom setting. Another thing that helps motivate me is combining lessons of language with culture. So, for example, in my class this year, when we were learning the vocab for cooking and shopping and like groceries, what we actually did is we, as part of our assignments, not only did we learn vocab, but we had to go out to a Chinese grocery store, buy groceries, and then come back to school and make a Chinese dish. So my group made dumplings. It was a ton of fun making those from hand. And those ties between the language and the culture are really important, because at the end of the day, Chinese isn't just a language. It is a culture. It is a group of people. So learning how to connect to the culture as well also really motivates me. And then on the flip side, I guess demotivation is kind of the one-dimensional traditional learning approach where, it's only, vocab, tests and quizzes. Those kinds of things, they make learning in general, but especially learning language, really boring. It doesn't allow for the introduction of any culture alongside the language or creativity. So that one-dimensional learning approach is something that I would avoid.
Mm-hmm. Great. Oriana, would you like to briefly mention something?
Yeah, I agree with Trace, Amani, and Blake in that the thing that motivates me the most to learn Chinese is definitely like a fun classroom. For all 4 years that I've taken Chinese, every single time that I walk into the class, we do a 生词比赛, and we like practice learning all the words that we learned, and it's like competitive and it's really fun. And obviously it's just like memorizing like all that you did before, but in an interactive way that has some sort of value to you, because we all like to win. And I think that's really nice as well. Or like when we were learning about like moving objects or stuff. I remember my teacher had a plush fish, and she was like, 我把鱼让给你, and threw it at me. Like that type of stuff just makes it more fun and interactive. And I definitely agree with what Trey said in that the classroom setting can get super, super boring, but I think especially when learning a language, since it's used in everything that we do, there are so many ways to implement creative outlets into it, and I think that's really important, especially when teaching students and really when teaching anyone, because everyone likes to have fun and it's better to associate learning with also having fun instead of being boring. So.
Wonderful. That's a great summary. Thank you. And we're a little bit late, but right in time. And there's one question addressed to Amani. Amani, you mentioned how your teacher helps you make connections to the intonation of English language. such as first tone sounds like tada.
Yeah, of course. So I share that anecdote just because it really stuck with me. And in this class, my teacher just opened it saying that here are the forward tones. Ta-da, ta-da.
Oh.
Yes, yes. 第二声, so. Like they're like, you're mad at your parents, oh, clean your room or whatever. So, 第三声, and then no for like, no, 第四声. And that was just the way it stuck with me. Like even like decades later, I'm still talking about it. But I think that was just the hook. But then the onus did come up on me on how was I going to implement this. So that's, as I mentioned earlier, was then I was like, this is what this is supposed to sound like or what this is supposed to be. So in moments when I didn't know, I'm trying to think of a word like bait, like let me say cut baits, ta-da, ta-da, baits. I would have to do that. I sound a little silly talking to myself in Chinese, but I would refer to that when I was getting really confused, and it was just a foundation as I was able to grow in my Chinese. And I hope that helps a little bit.
It helps a lot. Now I'm clear. It's great. That's a great strategy. I think we still have a few minutes. If anyone like to mention something, we can continue, or we can, let's see if we have questions. Can you give us some advice, to teachers and to students as learners for learning Chinese, for motivation, or particularly how to resolve problems, how to confront difficulties and challenges? Any advice? How their teachers should help their students, things like that.
Well, I think that having the mindset that this is a learning process and that inevitably there are going to be mistakes made is key. When you're learning something new, a language or not, there are going to be things that you mess up, that you don't get right the first time. But taking those as opportunities to learn rather than just pointing out those errors is extremely important. So if you mess up a pronunciation, going back and figuring out why you messed up the pronunciation or what the tone mark, what the correct tone might be or something like that. I feel like taking those mistakes, turning them into learning moments as both teachers and as learners is something that's really important, and understanding that you're going to make mistakes within the learning process.
Definitely. This is correct. Corrective feedback is important. How much you should correct students and to what extent students' errors should be all corrected, or what's the effect, particularly what's the effect of correction. So I agree with you. That is important part. A question on Star Talk. I did Star Talk, but I could not find the question.
Yeah, I think the question was just seeing if any of us did Star Talk. I myself, I've heard of it, but I have not participated in the program.
Although these students haven't participated in Star Talk, they learned in their own way. I think something most important to sum up is, in addition to emotional part of learning, for example, calm yourself down, take it easy. This is a process. This is nothing that serious. You will get there. And also the practical efforts, this self-regulatory mechanisms that you use it constantly, subconsciously or consciously, it becomes learning habit. Once it becomes learning habit, then difficulties cannot demotivate students anymore. instead is the challenge. And these guys love challenge. Many our students choose to learn Chinese because of the challenges and because of the difficult nature of the language. So we also need to recognize that part so that we will not lose these brilliant students. At the same time, they can help to inspire and also help other students to learn together. As Oriana mentioned one time, she said, if other students are as excited as I am, I feel this is a good community, so we learn together. So this classroom tone is so important, where students are all excited under the facilitation of the teacher. Other questions? Okay, I think we're getting there. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for our brilliant students as represented here by these 4 students.